Okay, well, good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for allowing me to share my second love with you. Paddle Steamer Waverley is a most extraordinary piece of engineering heritage, and it's a thing of some beauty. My background is a railway engineer, but since I retired 10 years ago, I'd spent a fair bit of my time as a volunteer on the ship and learned a lot about it, and I'm glad of the opportunity to share it with you. So a bit of background first of all, if I can get this thing to work. The paddle steamer Waverley is the second paddle steamer Waverley. The first one was ordered by the North British Railway, as you can see, launched in 1899, and sadly and tragically, it was sunk with many hundred troops on board at Dunkirk. One of the many casualties of that time. In 1945, the LNER ordered a replacement for the Waverley and got government funding for it. And that was built in A&J English Yard, which is now the site of the Riverside Museum. That's where the River Kelvin joins the Clyde. A very, very much changed scenario, as you can see, but that's where the Waverley was actually born. And it actually did its maiden voyage in 47, and it operated with various companies until it was with Calmac, but with the coming of the motorcar and various other things, paddle steamers were just economic, and it was sold to the Paddle Steamer Preservation Society for £1. And since 1975, it's been operating under preservation, which is almost for twice as long as is its commercial history. It was substantially rebuilt got a Millennium Heritage Lottery rebuild, but sadly last year there were boiler problems that I'll say a bit more about, and had to be taken out of service. Normally, Waverley gets all over the place, as well as a very comprehensive sailing season in the Clyde. It goes up to the Western Isles, usually at the beginning of June, and goes really right around the country, so it can be seen in many areas. And one of the reasons for that is that the finances of the Waverley are phenomenally demanding, and so therefore it just needs to go to those areas to generate the custom. And it's basically, the message is, you've got to sail it to preserve it to get the income, because Waverley's keeping the ship going is actually quite a large six-figure sum. And in many ways, it's much more demanding than railway preservation. So hopefully next year, it will be able to go to these places again. That's some images of the Heritage Lottery rebuild in 2000. You can just see just how much was done to the ship. I think that photo on the bottom right there of the plating being removed. Originally, Waverley was a riveted ship, but riveted ships are not allowed anymore. So there's lots of fake rivets above the waterline, but most of it's essentially welded. You would not, I don't think anywhere in the UK travel on a ship that's essentially traditional frame construction. In many ways, it is a truly historic vessel. That photograph top left, you can see it having the boilers that have just packed up are being replaced at 2000. And a little bit about the boilers. Waverley was originally fitted with a double-ended coal-fired boiler with 6 hand-stoked furnaces. It must have been back-breaking work to kind of keep the thing fired in those furnaces. Because it was a double-ended boiler, it actually needed 2 funnels. The British Railways converted it to coal firing in 56, and the original boiler was replaced by a single boiler in 81, which certainly made it more efficient. And as you can see on the bottom right, the original Waverley boiler is at the Maritime Museum in Irvine. And with the new boiler, it only needed 1 funnel, but of course we kept 2 funnels because it would have been an absolute outcry if you'd taken the other one away. Have a quick look inside the ship. Waverley, like all ships, has got compartments and watertight double bottoms. However, it doesn't meet modern compartmentalization standards because it needs a huge space in the middle for the boiler room and for the engine room. One of the things that a lot of people don't appreciate about Waverley is a substantial amount of it is taken up with crew accommodation. If the ship's going to sail all over the UK, you do need a place to put the crew, and it's rather cramped accommodation, but it takes up a lot of space on the ship. When working on the ship, I got to see things that the public don't normally see, and one of the fascinating things is the steering compartment, and I'll say a bit more about that later. To look at the engine, the engine's a triple cylinder compound engine. It delivers, as you can see, over 2,000 horsepower at 58 RPM. A wonderful piece of machinery. And the point is it actually reuses the steam. As a railway background, it's interesting to make the comparison with railway steam engines. And Waverley reuses its steam. Clearly, you can't use salt water in a boiler. You've no fresh water at sea, so you've got to reuse the steam. And because it's a triple cylinder engine, and I'll come to this right now, essentially the force in each piston rod has got to be the same. So what you actually have is cylinders of increasing size as the pressure goes down. So the force on the piston rod is the area of the piston times the pressure, essentially. And there are gauges on the ship that you can see, where you can see the pressure in those cylinders. And the size of the cylinders and the pressure in them are shown on that table on the top left there. The low pressure cylinder is 5 feet in diameter, and actually that exhausts a vacuum. It's kind of sucked rather than pushed, if you like. But the idea of this 5-foot cylinder thrashing backwards and forwards once a second is, as I say, it's quite an interesting bit of kit, is the engine. The other interesting thing about the Waverley engine is its valve gear. It's got Stephenson link valve gear, which is common to railway steam engines. And that's essentially an arrangement where you have 2 rods that are controlled by eccentrics that operate the valve spindles. And according to the position of the quadrant, depends which rod is operational. What's interesting is that, again, the comparison with steam engines. On a railway steam engine, if you're going from forward to reverse, tends to be a thing that you do quite gradually. On the Waverley, because it cannot steer below about 6 knots because there's no propeller in front of the rudder, it comes into appear at a fair old whack of knots, and it can decelerate very rapidly because of the paddles, but you've got to go into reverse very quickly. So therefore, the actual reversing gear, instead of being operated by a hand crank, as the case on a steam engine, has actually got its own steam engine, which actually makes it go into reverse very fast. Talk a bit about the boiler. The boilers that's on board, the 2 boilers, are standard industrial boilers, basically 3-pass boilers. There is a burner that burns all the fuel in a furnace tube, and then the hot gases go through 2 sets of boiler tubes, as you can see on that, 2nd pass, 3rd pass, and then up the exhaust at the back. And as I say, all the exhaust is at the back, so the front funnel. So the front funnel is used essentially just for the generator exhaust and such like, but certainly doesn't get anything like the exhaust as you get from the main boiler. As you can see, the boilers hold a large amount of water, and each requires 350 litres an hour, which indicates why Waverley is not a cheap ship to operate. But 5.5 tons of steam an hour at 180 psi is a lot of steam, a lot of energy. the main engine is only one of about 11 steam engines on the ship, and there used to be a lot more as well. There's windlass, capstans, the steam tiller, which is a beautiful thing to behold, we'll come to. Various pumps for flooding and fire pumps. Of course, the feed pump that actually feeds the boiler. So all that's fed from the main boiler, but the main boiler circuit takes the steam into the engine. Once that steam is used, it goes through a condenser, which is a heat exchanger with seawater being passed over tubes that's got the exhaust steam, and that condenses it. And that condensation, combined with another machine, which is an air pump, creates the vacuum that actually, if you like, sucks the low pressure cylinder around. It then goes through a hot water tank into feed pumps and then back into the boiler. So it's constantly recirculating. Very little steam is lost, although the engineers do get a bit annoyed with the captain if he blows the whistle too much, because that actually loses a fair bit of water. Now here's the steering, and this is something which is, it's a shame that this is not open to public view. Waverley has got, as well as its mechanical steam steering, an emergency wheel at the back, which confuses people. But should that pack up, through a series of clutches, it's possible to engage that emergency wheel so you can steer the ship from the back. When you do, it takes about 4 men to turn the wheel, and it's not particularly speedy, and they do practice that from time to time. But the main steering is a wheel on the bridge, which transmits a hydraulic signal through a system called Brown's telemotor. That is the identical system that was used on the Titanic, as a piece of trivia. We don't get many icebergs on the Clyde, so we don't need to worry about that. And that then transmits a hydraulic signal to a thing called a telemotor receiver, which operates an arm which it admits steam to a steam tiller. And this is a steam engine that lies flat, and it's a bit like a tiller on a canal boat, and it chugs backwards and forwards. And a bit more detail about that. As you can see, it's a relatively complex bit of kit. It actually, through a steam engine and a crankshaft and a worm, it actually drives a pinion that engages with a quadrant and moves this steam tiller backwards and forwards through a very clever, there's a very clever valve feedback mechanism, which means that it only chugs across as far as the steering wheel position, the wheel position. And the steam is admitted and exhaust through a steam trunnion, which is actually in line with the rudder stock. So I think that's a fabulous bit of kit. However, it's hidden to public view and nobody ever sees it. So let's move on to the paddle wheels. Paddle wheels are really quite enormous and weigh 8.5 tons each, and have got really quite a big area. Paddles are not as efficient as propellers, but you can operate a ship with paddles in shallower water. That, and also because, frankly, I think shipbuilders on the Clyde were quite traditional, meant that paddlers stayed on the Clyde for much longer than elsewhere, maybe. One interesting thing about the paddle wheels is that they have a feathering mechanism. The bit in brown there on the diagram on the left, the centre bit is a thing called a jenny nettle, and that's got a series of linkages, which actually means that the paddles enter the water at a steeper angle than they would have done if they were just fixed. And as I say, once the thing's operational, the floats at 42 RPM, the floats move through the water at about 30 feet per second. Now cruising speed is about 24 feet per second, so you don't get much difference. But if, however, you go into reverse, the speed differential is enormous, and the ship can virtually stop in its own length. Nothing's got the acceleration and deceleration of a paddle steamer of a paddle wheel for that sort of reason. but they are very serious and heavy bits of kit. And should anything go wrong, as these things are thrashing around at 42 RPM, weighing 8.5 tons, you would know about it, and that has happened in the past. There's a view of the paddle wheels taken when the ship was in dry dock. You can see the feathering mechanism on the photograph on the top left there, and you can see the main bearing that actually holds the entire weight of the paddle wheel on the right there. A bit of a look round inside the ship on what's known as the all-up deck, right at the very bottom. That's a view of the boilers. You can see the furnace fan there, and that's also the engine room. That's actually the valve cover for the low pressure cylinder. That cover weighs about 1.5 tons, and there isn't actually an easy way of getting it off. It's not as if you can. You've very little vertical clearance. The thing was not designed for easy maintenance, and working as a volunteer on the ship, it's really impressive what the engineers actually do to keep the thing operational. That view is again below decks. On the left there is the condenser, that cylinder, and on the right is the condenser pump. Again, it's steam operated, and that takes seawater to cool the condensate from the steam engine. It's one of the things about maintaining the Waverley is that in the old Clyde shipyards, there was many specialist engineers who did various things, be it steam packing or whatever. All that has, of course, gone. So the engineers and the volunteers on board the ship have actually got to maintain every bit of kit themselves, or find someone who's competent to do it. There's a view from the engine room, from the control panel, which shows the controls and the pressure gauges, and also a telegraph. Again, I don't think there's any other ship in the UK that's controlled where the engines are controlled by a telegraph. I mean, nowadays, of course, all the engine controls are with the captain on the bridge. An interesting thing about the Waverley is that on a traditional ship's telegraph, there is a repeater signal. The captain says half ahead or whatever it is, and then the engineer just cranks his repeater signal to acknowledge that signal to the captain. On a paddle steamer, because there is an urgency to implement the captain's command, there isn't a repeater signal. You don't waste time with that. You just execute the command immediately, and the captain knows it's done because he can feel the ship slowing down. So that's one of the many interesting differences. There is also a voice tube, no fancy electronics or anything like that. You know, you whistle in the voice tube and communicate with the captain. So in many ways, it is a wonderful piece of heritage. Winter maintenance, team of volunteers who strip everything and put everything together. You can see yours truly there, setting from the left. And there's an awful lot to be done, and but it is a good crack on board, and not so much now because everybody's getting on, but the two there on the top left are ex-Clyde shipyard workers, and the crack and the tales they had to tell were just absolutely brilliant. And actually moving heavy machinery around the ship without actually damaging the fine woodwork and such like is an enormous challenge, but through rigging various chain pulls and such like, it's possible to do it. That's the generator being brought up from the boiler room below. That was quite an interesting job. The ship's maintenance is governed by a 5-year survey cycle. Everything on the ship has got to be taken apart so that the MCA can look at it and put back together again every 5 years. The way it's done is that in wet dock, which is basically by the science centre, October to March, there's 3 paid employees and typically around 600 volunteer days to strip rebuild and inspect everything. And then it goes to dry dock, which is quite interesting. That photograph in dry dock actually shows the ship's got quite sleek lines. The actual paddle boxes make it look like quite a wide ship, but of course they aren't in the water. And in the dry dock, there's a statutory annual out-of-water inspection by the MCA, as well as painting, hull surveys, and any work that was identified during the wet dock maintenance also gets done. And it's quite interesting going into dry dock and just seeing what is done. One of the things I've not mentioned there, but it's equally important, there's an enormous amount of work done to maintain all the woodwork. Stripping that down, varnishing it and such like is also a never-ending task. So everything was going quite well until during the 18-19 season, the ship was due for its second major 10-year boiler survey, where cracks were found. Now, such cracks are normally repairable, but unfortunately, because there have been some previous patches as a result of contaminated fuel causing overheating, that was not possible because the patches would have overlapped. There were various proposals to actually repair the boiler by putting a new boiler hoop in, which was a major job, but it wasn't totally clear that that would have permanently sorted things, and the decision was taken that really the ship needed new boilers, which is a brave decision to take because that's about 2 million quid's worth of work, and there was no funding for that. But if the ship was going to have a long-term future, it needed new boilers. So a boiler appeal was launched, having announced in May that the ship wouldn't sail, and an enormous amount of work had been done to prepare for the season at that time. In June, the boiler refit appeal was launched. By July, enough money had been raised to actually order the boilers, which were a long lead item. Scottish Government in September announced £1 million funding. And I think it's worth saying that as well as being an item, a beautiful item of heritage, Waverley actually does support a lot of local economies. Places like Rothsay and Dunoon get a lot of benefit from the Waverley, although sadly haven't for these past 2 years. And in December, the appeal reached its target. So the boilers were able to be replaced. But there was all, because the boilers are being replaced, which involves taking the funnels off and various other things. At the same time, the opportunity was done to review the electrics, and the old alternators were replaced with new ones, with an additional outlet for light running, shore supply, various improved electronic controls, and a huge number of people were involved in that. And it was an impressive piece of work. But unfortunately, and then in beginning of the year, the ship was towed to Greenock. The funnels were taken off, the boilers were taken out, and by February, that's what the boiler room looked like. Of course, around February, things started to get a bit serious because of the COVID situation. But there's the ship in dry dock, having its normal work done, but with the funnels removed, and you can see the bit in the middle there where a hole had been created in the deck to get the boilers in and out. And then, of course, COVID struck. The sea trials, according to the original program, were programmed for the 16th of April. They actually took place on the 13th of August because the work was delayed because of COVID restrictions. But in a sense, that didn't matter because they were unable to carry passengers. But once the ship got its passenger certificate, it was established that having liaised with various people, that it was possible to operate a 2-week Clyde sailing program from August to September, with the ship operating at less than half its normal capacity. That means that this year the ship will carry about 3,500 passengers instead of its normal 140,000. So the ship has essentially lost 2 years worth of passenger income. That ship, that photograph on the bottom left was taken on Tuesday. Absolutely gorgeous day. Sorry, on Monday, I should say, not on Monday, because on Tuesday the weather was the exact opposite, and I couldn't imagine that I'd actually been on that the previous day. Just for 2 weeks, the ship is sailing. Those sailings, not surprisingly, are all a sellout. This is mechanical engineering at its finest. I thought I'd just show you a little bit. So that's her in action. So to conclude, sorry, I should have. How do I move on with this? Palestine Waverley is really a unique example of engineering heritage. But she's lost 2 years' income. So donations are no need to keep coming. So at this stage, I do a blatant appeal for donations. If anyone's able to donate to Waverley Excursions, I'm sure your donation will be well appreciated. But as a special offer, what I can offer you is that if anybody wishes to make a donation, this stylish face covering is available to anybody who would wish to. So if you wish to make a donation and want your face covering, just send me a copy of the receipt for your donation, and I'm sure John will give you your email, and I will post with your address, and I will post to you a copy of that stylish face covering. So with that, I would say thanks very much for listening, and hopefully for your support. Thank you very much.